G'day to you. I'm just practicing my Spider-Man moves. Yeah, I went to see Spider-Man, wow, what was it, last fall, like a lot of people did. And like a lot of people, even though I'm not a big Marvel Comics fan, I was interested in which is the best Spider-Man out of all the Spider-Mans. I heard there were going to be three Spider-Mans in this movie, and I imagine a lot of other people were watching the movie to figure out the same thing, although maybe you have a personal favorite towards one of the Spider-Men who had played in that movie. And I'm asking this question to start class off because until you see the movie, you can't really judge for yourself. In other words, you don't really know the truth of the answer to that question, which is the best Spider-Man, until you see the outcome, which is the movie itself. And so that's my way of introducing today's philosophical perspective, today's theoretical perspective, today's theoretical framework. It's called pragmatism. And it's uniquely American pragmatism. It's not the same as being practical. Practical is somebody who doesn't get caught up in ideals and just does what's best for the situation. That's not what pragmatism is. Pragmatism is about discovering the truth by looking at the outcomes. And what pragmatism is mostly concerned with when it comes to media is the role of government in regulating media. And so that's what we're going to be talking about mostly today. We have to get through the philosophical foundations before we can get to talking about government and regulation in media, but that's where we're headed. So let's ask some opening questions about government. These questions may be strange to you if you've only lived in the US and you only know one system of government and its relation to media, but we have basically three choices. We can have state-owned media. We have some of that in Russia. We have some of that in Korea. It's where the state or the government of the nation owns either all of the media or part of the media. In Russia, 2 or 3 television stations are owned or partially owned by the Russian government. So we've got state-owned media. And then we also have state-run media. That's very different. State-run media, we can say that the BBC World Service or France 2, which is that's the French word for two, Channel 2 in France, we can say that those are government-run stations, but they are not government-owned, they're private-owned. And in fact, they run commercials, but they are government-run or state-run. And then we can have independent media that operate independently, which is essentially how the media operate in this country, though with government regulation. So let's get into pragmatism now. Pragmatism is going to set up the base by which we can look at regulation. And it starts off with the American thinker, Charles Sanders Peirce. Although pragmatism is associated with many others, Charles Sanders Peirce is sort of known as the founder of this philosophical perspective. And it's, again, the perspective that assesses truth only in terms of the outcome. You can't speculate about Spider-Man and argue about it until you see the outcome. So truth, in other words, is the degree to which a concept provides us with results in solving problems. That's what pragmatism is supposed to be about, solving problems. And so, in a way, it's a slap against previous philosophy. You may or may not know about previous philosophy, which was concerned with the metaphysical world, the world up here, the abstract world, truth as it comes from up above. That's what a lot of philosophical thinking was concerned with before pragmatism. Pragmatism is not like that at all. Let's start off with William James. William James is the one to pick up on Charles Sanders Peirce's writings. William James lived from 1842 to 1910, so he was a couple centuries ago. He was a psychologist, and he wrote a book called Pragmatism. And in his book, he discussed that at the core of pragmatism is a habit. That is, we all have habits. And once again, before we go too far in this material, I'm not going to be mentioning much to do with media because I want you to do that frontier, groundbreaking work. I will be speaking about the philosophical perspective and look towards you to make those connections in your discussion, question, answers. So to get back to this idea of a habit, with William James, he says that people have habits. You know, everybody has habits. Some people like to go for walks. Some people like to shoot darts. Some people like to dance. Everybody has a habit. Some people like to read. Some people like to cook. William James says at the core of why we have habits is we are trying to discharge events from our brain. We have a brain that's completely occupied, and we need to get rid of stuff so that we can intake new stuff. And that's why we have habits. We have habits to expunge, to expel some of those events that are trapped inside of our head. So Williams James says that habits arise when external phenomena register with the brain. Like I was driving home last night and all of a sudden I saw flashing lights behind me. And I'm like, oh, what is that? Is that a police car? Is it an ambulance? Do I have enough time to get to my driveway to get in and out of his way? Or do I have to pull over now? Until finally that car got up on top of me and I saw, yes, it was in fact an ambulance, was not a police car, and I had a tremendous sense of relief. And I see all those thoughts escaped from my mind. Okay, good. Is my registration current? Is my inspection current? Is there anything in the car that might cause probable cause? Not really, not in my car, but these are thoughts that I had to expunge through that external phenomenon hitting me, those flashing lights. So James says that without habits, that the brain would have to generate new thoughts on its own. And that's too much work. So we have habits so that we're constantly clearing out and refreshing our brain. And James says that habits can be good. Like if you exercise in response to stress, you go take a walk, you go for a run, you work out, you play a sport because you're stressed out. That's a good habit. But habits can also be bad. Like if you're stressed out and you eat a whole bucket of ice cream, right? That's a habit, but it's not a good habit. Picking up on that idea of habits is John Dewey, our next philosopher, John Dewey. You probably know about him, right? You know the Dewey Decimal System in the library. That comes from John Dewey. He was an educational theorist. In other words, he was theorizing about the way that education should take place in our schools. And his book was Reconstruction in Philosophy. And he says about habits, he says that our ways of thinking are habits that people generate to overcome difficulties. So he's kind of similar to James. We perform habits for another reason, but not in the case of James to expunge events from our head. But with Dewey, it's more about we have these obstacles in our lives, so we develop habits so that we can overcome those obstacles. And he says that the ability to communicate, this is where our field comes into play, the ability to communicate, the field of communication, is what actually keeps other people's habits from calcifying. When something calcifies, it's fixed for the rest of life. So do you walk the same way to class every single time? Is there actually like 80% of the campus that you will never come across because you never just wander a different route? Well, what happens when you meet a friend and they're coming from a different part of campus, and so you walk with them and suddenly you're seeing the backside of a building you never saw before, or a pavilion, or you've been in a building you've never before. That's what John Dewey is talking about, that if those two people did not communicate, one of the people would be walking their same familiar habit for years and years and years. So you need other external events to help you to not have your habits calcify. And he invented a term that is also an important part of his theory. The term is called meliorism, M-E-L-I-O-R-I-S-M, meliorism. And that is the recognition of the elements that are present in a historical moment so that you can improve your condition. So being able to see those elements, it is what is so tough. And we've got two major epochs in the last few years that we can say there are a bunch of elements in those moments to look at, but can we recognize what those moments are? One is the pandemic. Can you truly realize everything that you were facing in the pandemic right now at this point in time? If you can, you have meliorism. If it's going to take 20 years for you to look back and say, I was really very vulnerable at that time period in my life. I was going through a breakup with a relationship. I lost my job. I got COVID. I had an uncle who passed. If it takes 20 years to look back, and to some extent that's going to occur anyhow, but meliorism is specifically about, can you recognize the historical moment that you might be in, and then can you apply reasoning to figure out what the outcomes are from that moment to determine whether you have pragmatism. We're going to develop that thinking a little bit more. So one more comment about Dewey, because I think it's important since you are all students in the American education system, is he said that it's very important for the American education system to move away from rote. Do you know what that word is? R-O-T-E. That's another word for habit. Rote memorization, and towards flexible problem solving. In other words, education in the U.S. used to just be about memorizing mathematical formulas, memorizing vocabulary words and definitions, memorization. John Dewey's responsible largely for a lot of your coursework at universities today involving small group work, involving problem-solving exercises. Even the discussion posts that I'm using in this class can be said to come from John Dewey's thinking. All right, let's go on to the third philosopher now. His name is Richard Rorty, R-O-R-T-Y. I forgot to give John Dewey's dates, by the way. He lived from 1859 to 1952, so he crossed over the centuries there, 59 to 1859, 1952. Richard Rorty comes later. He's from the 1900s, 1931 to 2007. So he's the most recent philosopher slash critical thinker that we've talked about in this class, passing away just about 15 years ago, Richard Rorty. He was an analytical philosopher. And he aligned philosophical work, that is, all the work that we've been doing in this class so far is philosophical, but his work was aligned with the hard sciences. Yeah, so he was not so much about humanistic exploration, even though that's what this class is mostly about. He was a scientist, and he wrote this book called Consequences of Pragmatism. And isn't that an interesting play on words, since pragmatism is already focused on consequences? So he invented the term ironism, just like iron, and then ism, like irony, but ironism. And that's the ability to see the world through contingent historical descriptions. Ironism is to see the world through contingent historical descriptions. Something that's contingent is uncertain. It's changeable. It's going through some kind of change right now. It's contingent. It depends what's going to happen. And so he says that the way you do this is you compare vocabularies of our past with alternative redescriptions. You compare vocabularies of the past with alternative redescriptions. So, for example, a lot of people look at incarceration in the United States as a problem that our society has. And if you look at U.S. incarceration, we have a lot of people in prisons. I should have some statistics to throw at you to back that up, but you know that. And so it's a problem, right? We don't want to have people in jail, do we? That's one way to look at it. But, I saw a documentary not too long ago that called prison the third wave of racism. The first wave being slavery. The second wave being Jim Crow laws from the South, which civil rights finally overturned, at least in theory. And the third wave is incarceration, because far more African Americans and Latinos are incarcerated than there are percentages of those people in our population. That's ironism, is it not? It's visiting a vocabulary of the past, talking about prison a certain way in the past, but now it's using an alternative description, third wave racism. That's what ironism is. And so Richard Rorty was really interested in creating societies and identities for people that had alternative redescriptions, constantly revisiting the past. I'm still shocked that the word handicapped is used on signs to show people where to park. Do you know where handicap comes from? Yeah, it's a term from the 1930s, when our country was in a depression and we had no Social Security for people to lean back on. So if you didn't have a job, if you had a disability, if you were missing a leg, for example, from the war, your only alternative just about was to stand on a street corner with a cap in your hand and ask for money. Handicap, handicap, hand in cap. Today we have blue signs all over campus saying handicap is so demeaning. We need ironism, I think, to go back and take a look at that and how we've described it in the past and describe it for what it is today, which is an offensive put-down word. Also, Richard Rorty's last concept before we move on, last concept that Richard Rorty developed was relativism. And this is where diverse theories and approaches are all equally correct depending on the situation. And that flies in the face of a lot of philosophical thinkers who've said, oh no, if you have a principle, you must follow it. All right, now let's go on to the subject that we've been meaning to get to, which is a pragmatic approach. Remember, pragmatism is trying to discover the truth by looking at the outcomes, a pragmatic approach to government and the regulation of media. So the first element that you have to look at when you're trying to analyze something from a pragmatic standpoint is the consequences. And so you have to ask, what are the clear effects of regulation on society, and are those regulations good? So one of the regulations we have in the United States is you cannot commit libel in a broadcast. Do you know what libel is? That's where you smear somebody's reputation unfairly and so that they suffer. They can't get a better job, they lose their job, they go through emotional suffering, need to see counseling. It's like if you were a radio journalist and you jumped on the air and you called a university president a drunk, and then that university president has all kinds of problems on their hands. That could be a libel case. It might not. I mean, truth is something that has to come into play. So, but consequences is looking at that very idea. Are the regulations harmful or hurtful? And you can answer that question maybe about libel for yourself. We don't want journalists calling leaders or really anybody else, common citizens, things that they are not if it's going to harm them, right? So that might be a good consequence of the law of libel. All right, let's go on next to contingency. We've mentioned that word. That's also involved in a pragmatic approach. And this may seem really fuzzy and wide open. Excuse me, because when you're discussing contingency, you are actually using context and situation to assess the event. You have to consider context and situation. If I see somebody throwing beer bottles in the parking lot of the fraternity, I might say, you know, this is really outrageous. I got to go over there and see what's going on or call the cops. But then maybe what I find out is it's actually a game and they're throwing the bottles on the lawn and they're trying to get it to a basketball hoop. And the context is totally changed as long as they pick the bottles up, in my opinion. So in other words, pragmatism really rejects constants, which is a strong feature of previous philosophy. Pragmatism rejects constants, and instead we have regular contingencies. For example, we have a contingency between free speech and public interest. Free speech and public interest. Do you know about the Food Lion case and ABC? Do you know about that? Food Lion is a grocery store chain down in, well, it's down in the South, but this particular one was in Florida. And there were rumors that at this particular Food Lion, there was unhealthy meat handling going on. People handling meat with their hands instead of gloves, leaving it hung up for too long past the expiration date, things like that. And so ABC's Nightline, which is a magazine, a news magazine, they went to Food Lion, and two of the reporters there got jobs. They applied and got jobs as meat handlers, and they went back into the meat handling area with cameras hidden in their buttons, and they recorded all kinds of abuses of the rules and regulations for handling meat, including not using gloves, like I said. So they did a story on Food Lion, and you can imagine the public relations nightmare for Food Lion. However, Food Lion sued ABC because they said that the reporters misrepresented themselves when they got a job with Food Lion. They didn't say that they were reporters for a major network, a major television network. So they sued, and the jury found ABC guilty. But listen to this. Do you know what the damage was? They inflicted a fine on ABC News of $1. $1. So in other words, what this jury was saying was it was wrong for ABC to misrepresent its reporters as being people just seeking jobs. But in the public interest, it's much more important that this information got out so that people are not eating contaminated meat and having health problems. And that is what we're talking about here as a regular contingency, is deciding when should we have free speech in this country? When should we allow obscenity or hate speech or any other kind of speech that pushes the boundaries? And when should we say, no, we got to shut it off because it's in the public interest for safety or for feelings or for demeaning the human condition? Also, in a pragmatic approach, to move to the last idea here, pragmatic approach to government and media regulation, is under regular contingencies, is the interplay between government regulation and media self-regulation. In our country, in essence, we prefer media to regulate themselves. You know the ratings that you see on television for whether programming is crude, offensive, adult, etc.? Same in film, same on video gaming. Those ratings are not developed by government. Those ratings are developed by associations that are professional associations for those media organizations. In the case of film, it's the Motion Picture Association, MPPM. There's another P in there. I forget what it stands for, MPPA. They develop it. It's the industry developing the regulation, not the government. However, the government will step in. The government will step in and fine a station. I can guarantee you if a station were to go on the air and start being really pro-Russia in the United States, the government would find a way to shut it down right now. And so that's another interplay. It's another contingency. It's another state of flux for society, but it speaks to a tension that exists that pragmatism has some bearing on. And that's between government regulating media through fines and laws and rules versus media allowed to regulate themselves. Now we're going to go to some overall issues of regulation in American media, where government has sought to say we need to have regulations to effect good outcomes, which is what pragmatism is all about. And then we know the truth of whether the regulations are working. So one of the areas we've already talked about, and that's combating monopolies. We've talked about that under Marx. We've talked about that under organizational analysis. It's the idea that you cannot have competition if you have too few companies owning the situation. And so we actually have a Department of Justice in the United States, and the Department of Justice reviews media purchases to make sure that there won't be, hopefully, a monopoly. The most recent one was AT&T, the cell phone company, bought Time Warner, which is itself a leftover company from many other companies, Time Magazine, Warner Company, Time Warner together. AT&T was blocked for a long time until the Justice Department could analyze and make sure that there wouldn't be unfair competition as a result of that. Another issue in the regulation of American media is protecting intellectual property. And that's very hard to do in a digital age because it is so easy to copy something and to pirate it. So in the area of music, for example, we have 3 licensing companies that are provided for by law to require you as a radio station to pay a copyright fee if you're going to play music that is assigned to these license companies. You may or may not know them. You don't have to for this class, but we've got ASCAP, we've got BMI, and we've got CSAC. They are all music labels, and they're all copyright collection agencies is really what they are. They collect copyright fees, and then they pay those fees in the form of royalties to artists and performers. So it's another area that pragmatism is really concerned with, and that's protecting the creative work of people who have created it so that it doesn't get made money off of by somebody else without the person who creating the work sharing in the profits. Another area of regulation that pragmatism has taken a look at is maintaining national interests. This is all over the news right now when there's a war, when there's a conflict, when there's tension between 2 countries on borders with each other. You are going to see government taking a close look at regulating or monitoring TV broadcasts, radio broadcasts, tech companies to make sure that they are not working against the national interest. Many students in this class are using TikTok without realizing that TikTok is owned by a Chinese company. TikTok is constantly being looked at by the U.S. government to figure out whether there are bots in there or whether there are algorithms that are going to be working against the national interests of the U.S. Yet another area of regulation that pragmatism is concerned with when it comes to media is diversity. Diversity, making sure that there is diversity in the workplace in terms of ethnicity, religion, etc. Not all areas, but mostly ethnicity. In fact, most radio and TV stations, those that have 5 employees or more, they have to file what's known as an EEO report to the FCC, a federal government regulatory agency. And that EEO report is called Equal Opportunity. And they have to equal employment opportunity, I should say. And they have to prove that they have interviewed X amount of African Americans, X amount of Latinos, X amount of Asians, X amount of Amerindians, X amount of diverse people. They have to file those radio and TV stations every year. That's about consequences, looking at, is that improving the situation in media? Is it opening up positions and employment to people who have been discriminated against? Next up is the area of managing morality. Managing morality, if you want to call it that. I mean, my dad used to say there's no morality in sex, but this country seems to think there is. We have very strict laws when it comes to obscenity and profanity and nudity. We even have a time of day when broadcasters can think that they are somewhat safe from the fines that may come their way from the FCC. That time period is called a safe harbor. Safe harbor. And that's from 10 o'clock at night until 6 in the morning. And that's when radio stations and TV stations can get a little bit looser with their content. They can allow, for example, bitch to air in a song, or maybe even asshole, whereas before 10 o'clock, no. The thinking there, if you can get this, is that young people are more likely to be asleep from 10 o'clock until 6 in the morning and therefore won't be exposed. I can tell you from raising 2 kids, that is exactly when they are awake. So safe harbor makes no sense to me on that. We'll talk a lot more about obscenity in this class later on. Finally, we have the area of ensuring accuracy. Very important in media, even though people throw around the term fake news all the time today. Accuracy is still important. I've already talked about libel as one area that we take a look at. Accuracy is an important area of media. You have to get your facts right. You have to report what's going on. Otherwise, if people start to lose faith and confidence in the media, which is we've already established, which is where most people are getting their information in the world, because they're getting their information symbolically, not somatically. All right, I said we had one final area, but which I said was accuracy, but I'm going to separate out as the book now our final subject for today, which is all about violence. Violence. This is a very tricky area to talk about when it comes to media regulation, because people have different views on violence, but one thing is for certain, we have a very violent country in the U.S. You can look at the murders in Philadelphia, set a record last year, record murders by guns in Philadelphia last year. We have a lot of violence. Just look at any local news story, you can see people being arrested for violence all the time, and yet there's a lot of contingent thinking about this. In other words, pragmatic thinking, saying it really depends. For example, it depends whether you subscribe to violence having an aggressor effect. In other words, if people watch violence in media, now we are swinging over to media, that it actually triggers violence in them. So all the people who have committed these school shootings, the investigators often take a look at their media habits. They often take a look at their video gaming habits to try and determine whether something that has happened in their regular diet of media content has aroused something in them that they extend beyond that virtual world into the real world. Or maybe you have a different view. Maybe you have a victim effect, and that's where you perceive a violence wherein people who experience violence, it's a heightened effect for them. It is pure arousal and nothing more. It's nothing more. It's pure arousal, and they're excited by it. And so it stops there. So it's perfectly acceptable. But then there's the bystander effect. The bystander effect is what media content that has a lot of violence in it does to people, is it gets them not to see violence as something that's out of the ordinary that they need to take care of. There are many stories of walking through New York and people say they saw somebody getting mugged and nobody helped them. That's what this is talking about. I'm not trying to stereotype New York that way. I was in New York last week. No problems at all. Great time. But the bystander effect says that we become desensitized to violence because we see so much of it and therefore we're not affected by it when we should be. And then there is the theory that violence in media offers a catharsis effect. That it actually allows people who have pent-up hostilities to release those hostilities, which would otherwise not be released, and then they would be let go on actual people. They would enact violence on actual people, but sit them down in front of a video game, take them out to watch a film that has a lot of shooting up and special effects, and it's all worked out of their system, and now they can return to normalcy. That's for you to decide. So in the end, when we're talking about pragmatism, we're looking at the effects and the consequences of the regulations that we're putting into place, and we're trying to decide whether they're good or bad, which itself leads to a whole discussion of contingency. Have a great day.